The rain had not stopped for 3 days when the girl arrived at the gates of Ashworth Hall. She carried nothing but a small bundle wrapped in cloth, and even that she held as though someone might snatch it from her at any moment. Her boots were split at the seams. Her hands were raw from cold. The housekeeper who opened the servant's door took one look at her and sighed, the way a person sighs at one more burden in a long week of burdens. "You're the new girl," the housekeeper said. It was not a question. "Yes, ma'am." "Name?" There was the smallest pause, barely long enough to notice unless you were listening for it. "Mary," the girl said. The housekeeper did not ask for a surname. Girls like this rarely had one worth writing down, or so she assumed. She waved her inside out of the rain and set her to work before her cloak had even dried against her shoulders. She did not know that the girl standing before her, dripping onto the flagstones, had once been announced into ballrooms by a footman who called her name in full 3 times, so that every head in the room would turn. She did not know that this girl had eaten from silver, had been fitted for gowns by a modiste who came to her, had a father who called her his whole heart and meant it. She did not know because no one was meant to know. That had been arranged, carefully and cruelly, by people who wanted her forgotten. The girl who called herself Mary was given a cot in the attic, a gray dress 2 sizes too large, and a list of duties longer than her arm. She accepted all of it without complaint, because complaint was a luxury she no longer owned. It was on her very first afternoon, not 4 hours into her new life, that she was told the master of the house had returned early from riding and wanted his boots seen to before supper. "Leave them outside his study door when you're finished," the housekeeper told her, "and mind you don't dawdle. His Grace does not like to wait." Mary carried the boots down the servants' stairs, past the kitchens, into the narrow passage that led toward the front of the house, a part of Ashworth Hall she had not yet been permitted to see. The boots were heavy with mud, caked nearly to the ankle, and she balanced them awkwardly against her hip as she walked. She did not see the study door open. She did not see the man who stepped out of it, tall and unhurried, dressed for riding still, his dark coat splattered with the same mud now drying on his own boots' twin. She walked directly into him, and the boots she carried fell from her arms and struck the polished floor with a sound like a slap. "I beg your pardon," she said quickly, dropping to gather them, her face burning. "I didn't see." "Clearly." The word was not unkind, but it was not warm either. She looked up. She should not have looked up. A servant did not look up and found herself facing the Duke of Ashworth for the first time in her life, though she did not yet know it was the first of many. He was younger than she had expected, younger and far more still. He had the look of a man who rarely needed to raise his voice, because people rarely needed telling twice. His eyes moved over her, not unkindly, but assessing, the way a man might glance at a piece of furniture that had been moved without his permission. Then they dropped to the boots now clutched against her chest, smearing mud across the front of her gray dress. "Those are mine, I take it." "Yes, Your Grace." She had learned the address before she had learned anything else about this house. It was the first thing any servant learned. "Then I suggest you finish the task rather than wear it." There was, perhaps, the faintest curve at the corner of his mouth. Perhaps. She could not be certain, and she did not have the luxury of studying it further, because he was already moving past her, already forgetting her, already the kind of man to whom a new maid on her first day was a thing that happened and was immediately over. He did not ask her name. He had no reason to. She was one of a dozen girls who came and went through the servants' hall each year, indistinguishable from the last, useful only insofar as his boots were clean, and his fires were lit, and his rooms were silent when he wished them to be. He did not know that 3 counties away, a portrait of this same girl hung above a cold hearth in a house that no longer belonged to her family. He did not know that men had searched for her for the better part of a year, some out of grief, others, the more dangerous ones, out of something closer to fear. He did not know that the girl now scrubbing mud from his boots in a narrow servants' corridor had a true name that, spoken aloud in the right rooms of London, would have brought half the peerage to its feet. He knew none of it. She made certain, that evening and every evening after, that he continued not to know. But some truths do not stay buried simply because they are convenient to forget. And in the months that followed, the Duke of Ashworth would come to look back on this rain-soaked afternoon, the fallen boots, the mud on her dress, the name she gave him without meeting his eyes, and understand that it had been the first thread in an unraveling neither of them could have stopped, even if they had known enough to try. A year earlier, the girl who now answered to Mary had answered only to one name, Lady Margaret Winslow, only daughter of the Earl of Rosemere. She had grown up in a house full of light, not wealth alone, though there was plenty of that, but light, the particular kind that comes from being loved without condition. Her father, the Earl, had lost his wife when Margaret was a child too young to properly grieve, and in the years that followed he had poured into his daughter everything a colder man might have spent on remarriage, on politics, on the pursuits expected of men in his position. He taught her to read Latin badly and love it anyway. He let her ride astride when no one was watching. He called her his whole heart, and he was not a man given to exaggeration. It was, by any measure, a happy childhood, which is precisely why what came after felt less like misfortune and more like betrayal. The Earl's health began to fail the winter Margaret turned 19. It came on slowly at first, a cough that lingered, a tiredness he waved away as nothing. By spring, the physicians no longer bothered pretending optimism in front of her. It was during this decline that Lord Hollies entered the household, with the ease of a man who had always intended to. He was the Earl's cousin, several times removed but close enough in blood that when whispers began of the estate's future, his name surfaced quickly. He arrived at Rosemere with his wife, Lady Hollies, ostensibly to help manage affairs while the Earl recovered. He was solicitous. He was patient. He complimented Margaret's needlework and asked after her comfort, and made himself, within a matter of weeks, entirely indispensable to a household too consumed with illness to notice how thoroughly he had inserted himself into its ledgers, its correspondence, its future. Margaret did not like him. She could not have said precisely why at first, only that his kindness had a quality to it that never quite reached his eyes, the way a well-tailored coat can still hang wrong on the wrong sort of man. Her father, weakened and trusting, saw only a relative stepping in during a difficult hour. "He has been good to us," the Earl told her once from his sickbed, his voice thinner than it had been the year before. "When I am gone, you will need someone to see to things properly." "I do not trust him," Margaret said. Her father smiled, the way parents smile at fears they believe time will cure. "You do not have to trust him, my dear. You only have to marry well and let the rest sort itself out." It was the last real conversation they had. The Earl died 3 weeks later, in the small hours of a June morning, with only a nurse and Lord Hollies present at his bedside. A detail Margaret would turn over in her mind many times in the months that followed, without ever being able to prove what it meant. What she did know, within days of the funeral, was that the will read aloud in the drawing-room bore little resemblance to the one her father had described to her over the years. Certain provisions had changed. Certain guardianships, hers among them, absurdly, as though a woman of 19 required a guardian, had shifted into Lord Hollies's hands with a thoroughness that suggested careful planning rather than grief. Margaret was, by law and by the document now sitting on the estate's solicitor's desk, no longer mistress of her own future. She said nothing at first. She watched. She had inherited her father's patience along with his stubbornness, and she told herself that time would reveal whatever needed revealing, that solicitors and courts existed for precisely this kind of quiet theft. She did not yet understand that Lord Hollies had no intention of leaving her the time to use them. The betrayal, when it came, did not announce itself. It came dressed as concern. 6 weeks after the funeral, Lady Hollies appeared at Margaret's door one evening with a tray of tea neither of them wanted, and a conversation neither of them could avoid. "You look unwell," Lady Hollies said, settling into the chair across from her with the practiced ease of a woman who had learned long ago how to make herself comfortable in other people's houses. "The grief has been hard on you." "I am well enough." "You are pale, you hardly eat." Lady Hollies poured the tea without being asked, added sugar Margaret did not want, and pressed the cup into her hands the way one might press a cup into the hands of an invalid. "Lord Hollies and I have discussed it. We think a change of air would do you good. The sea, perhaps, Bath or Weymouth." Margaret set the cup down untouched. "I have no wish to travel." "It was not entirely a suggestion, my dear." The words hung there, mild and terrible. What followed over the next fortnight happened with a swiftness that, looking back, Margaret would understand had been planned for weeks, perhaps longer. A physician she had never met called upon her and left murmuring words like melancholy and nervous exhaustion to Lord Hollies in the hallway, just loud enough for her to hear through the door. Letters she wrote to family friends, to her father's solicitor, to anyone who might have helped her, went unanswered. She would learn much later that they had never left the house at all. And then, one gray morning in July, a carriage arrived at Rosemere before dawn, and Margaret was told, not asked, that she was leaving for an aunt's residence in the north to recover her health. There was no aunt in the north. There had never been an aunt in the north. She understood this fully only once the carriage had traveled 2 days' distance from everything she knew, and the driver, a man she had never seen in her father's employ, turned off the main road onto a track she did not recognize, toward a destination he refused to name. "Where are we going?" she demanded for perhaps the 10th time. The driver did not answer. He had been paid generously not to. It was somewhere on the 3rd day, in a coaching inn where she was left briefly unwatched while the driver saw to the horses, that Margaret made a decision that would alter the rest of her life. She took what coin she had sewn into the lining of her cloak, a habit her old nurse had taught her, more from superstition than foresight, and she walked out the back of the inn into a market square crowded enough to disappear into. She did not know, that afternoon, whether she had saved her own life or simply chosen a slower way to lose it. What she learned only weeks later, through a chance remark overheard between 2 servants at an inn where she'd taken temporary shelter, was what had been arranged for her at that unnamed destination, and what story had been told, back at Rosemere, to explain her absence. Lady Margaret Winslow, it was said, had succumbed to a decline of the nerves while visiting relations, and had died quietly, tragically, in her sleep. A memorial service was held. A stone was placed. Lord Hollies wept beautifully at the appropriate moments, and within the year, the courts, having no reason to doubt a grieving family's account, confirmed him as rightful heir to what remained of the Rosemere estate. The girl the story had buried was, at that very moment, 3 counties away, cutting her own hair short with a borrowed knife in the back room of a coaching inn, preparing to become someone no one would think to look for. She chose the name Mary because it was common enough to vanish into. She chose service because a woman with no family and no references could still, if she was fortunate and careful, find work in a house large enough that no one asked too many questions of a girl willing to scrub floors for her bed and board. She had heard through the same servant's gossip that had told her of her own death that the Duke of Ashworth's household was hiring a large estate, a busy one, the kind of place where a new face drew little notice. She arrived at its gates 3 days later in the rain, carrying nothing but a bundle wrapped in cloth and a name that was not her own. The first month at Ashworth Hall taught Mary two things: how to disappear and how much a person could bear without breaking. She learned the rhythms of the house quickly, which stairs creaked, which rooms she was never to enter without knocking twice, which of the other maids could be trusted with a kind word and which could not. She learned to keep her eyes down in hallways, her hands busy, her voice quiet enough to go unnoticed. She had been raised to fill a room. Now she had trained herself in a matter of weeks to become invisible in one. It was not as difficult as she had feared. Grief, she found, had a way of making a person small without effort. The housekeeper, Mrs. Pemberton, was neither cruel nor especially kind, simply efficient, running the household with the brisk indifference of a woman who had seen 100 girls come through the servants' hall and expected to see 100 more. She noted within the first fortnight that the new girl was a peculiar sort of quick. She learned tasks after being shown them only once. She folded linens with a neatness the other girls lacked. And there was, more than once, something in the way she spoke, brief, careful, but oddly precise, that did not entirely match the rough manner of her dress. Mrs. Pemberton put it down to a good upbringing gone to ruin, as happened sometimes to girls who fell on hard luck. She did not think much further on it. She had a household of 40 rooms to manage and no leisure to wonder about one maid's history. The Duke of Ashworth, for his part, thought of the new girl not at all, or so it seemed in those early weeks. He was a man consumed by his own concerns, as men of his position generally were. There was the estate's tenant disputes to settle, a younger sister recently arrived from school, and in need of guidance he felt ill-suited to provide, and a mother, the Dowager Duchess, who wrote from London twice weekly with increasingly pointed remarks about his continued lack of a wife. He had little attention left over for the comings and goings of the servants' hall, and even less interest in learning the names of maids who kept, sensibly, out of his way. Mary made certain to keep out of his way entirely. It was not difficult at first. A duke and a scullery maid moved through entirely different currents of the same house, rarely crossing paths except by accident, as they had, disastrously, on her very first day. She took care, after that, to know his schedule as well as she knew her own duties, which hours he rode, which rooms he took his correspondence in, which hallways he was likely to pass through and when. She avoided him successfully for nearly 6 weeks. It could not, of course, have lasted. Not in a house of 40 rooms with only so many hallways, and not with a man who, she began slowly to notice, had a habit of appearing where he was least expected. The first real conversation between them happened by accident, in the library, on an evening she had believed the house asleep. Mary had been sent to see to the fires before retiring, a task she generally finished in the early evening, but a delay in the kitchens had pushed her hours later than usual. She let herself into the library expecting silence and dark, and found instead a single lamp burning, and the Duke seated in a chair by the window with a book open, unread, in his lap. He looked up before she could retreat. "You needn't leave," he said when she hesitated in the doorway. "The fire's gone half out. See to it if you would." She crossed the room quickly, kneeling at the hearth, aware of him watching her with the mild, unhurried attention of a man who had nothing better occupying his thoughts. She built the fire back up with more care and more speed than the task strictly required, hoping to be finished and gone before he thought to speak again. "You're the girl who dropped my boots," he said. It was not a question, but she answered as though it were. "Yes, Your Grace." "Mary, was it?" "Yes, Your Grace." He was quiet a moment, and she felt, foolishly, she told herself, the weight of his attention settle on her more fully than it had any right to. "You read," he said finally. Her hands went still over the fire iron. "Your Grace." "There." He nodded toward the low shelf beside the hearth, where she had, out of habit rather than thought, straightened a row of books left in disarray, and turned each spine outward, in the particular order her father's old librarian had taught her as a child, by subject, and then by author, a system almost no one outside her old household would have recognized. She had not even realized she'd done it. "I only tidied them, Your Grace," she said carefully. "They were out of order." He did not press further, though something in his expression suggested he had noted it, filed it away, the way a careful man files away small inconsistencies he cannot yet explain. "That will be all, Mary." She finished the fire and left as quickly as propriety allowed, her heart beating harder than the task warranted. It was, she told herself afterward, nothing. A small carelessness, easily forgotten by a man with far weightier matters on his mind. She did not yet understand that the Duke of Ashworth was not, in fact, a man who forgot small inconsistencies. He simply chose, for reasons of his own, to wait before mentioning them again. The weeks that followed the incident in the library did not bring the confrontation Mary feared. Nothing happened. The Duke said nothing further about the books, asked nothing further about her manner of speech, made no mention of the strange precision with which she had once corrected a footman's arithmetic on the household accounts within earshot of the housekeeper. An error she'd caught almost without thinking, the numbers simply wrong to her eye the way a wrong note is wrong to a musician's ear, and which she had regretted the moment the words left her mouth. But she began to notice, in small ways, that she was being watched. It was nothing so crude as suspicion. The Duke did not summon her for questioning, did not set traps, did not do any of the things a lesser man might have done to satisfy a nobleman's idle curiosity about an oddity among his staff. What he did instead was subtler, and in some ways far more unsettling. He simply began to be present. In the library on evenings she came to see to the fire. In the corridor near the breakfast room when she carried trays. On the east lawn, once, when she had been sent to cut flowers for the dining table, and did not hear his approach until his shadow fell across the roses. "You've a good eye for that," he said, nodding at the small arrangement already forming in her basket, not the haphazard bundling most maids managed, but something with actual composition to it, height and color balanced with an unconscious sense of proportion. "Thank you, Your Grace," she said, and kept her eyes on the flowers, because she had learned that looking at him for too long invited exactly the kind of attention she could not afford. "Where did you learn flowers?" The question was simple. It should not have unsettled her as much as it did. "I don't know that I learned them anywhere in particular, Your Grace. I suppose I've always had an eye for it." It was, she thought afterward, a reasonably good lie. Vague enough to be unverifiable, plain enough not to invite further questions. But she was learning, slowly and with growing unease, that the Duke of Ashworth possessed an unfortunate talent for asking exactly the sort of quiet, ordinary questions that a person telling the truth would answer without thought, and that her hesitations, however brief, were not going unnoticed. He did not press her that day either. He simply looked at her a moment longer than was strictly comfortable, thanked her for the flowers as though she were not the one who had cut them, and walked on toward the stables, leaving her standing among the roses with her pulse unaccountably loud in her own ears. It became, over the following months, a strange and unspoken pattern between them. He asked small questions. She gave small answers, careful and incomplete. He watched her with the patient, unhurried attention of a man solving a puzzle he had decided not to rush, and she moved through her days increasingly aware of being observed, not with suspicion exactly, not yet, but with something that felt uncomfortably like interest. She told herself repeatedly that it meant nothing. Noblemen were curious creatures by nature, bred to notice inconsistency, the way hunting dogs were bred to notice scent, and a duke with an educated maid beneath his roof was simply an anomaly worth a passing thought before it was forgotten in favor of weightier concerns. She told herself this on the evenings she found excuses to avoid the library. She told herself this on the mornings she took the longer route to the dining room specifically to avoid the corridor where he so often seemed to be standing, coincidentally, exactly when she passed. She told herself this, and increasingly she did not entirely believe it. It was not only his attention that unsettled her, it was her own growing awareness of him. She noticed, against every instinct toward self-preservation, the way he spoke to the tenants who came to the estate with grievances, patient and direct in a manner that suggested he actually listened to their answers rather than merely tolerating them. She noticed the careful, almost clumsy gentleness with which he handled his younger sister, Lady Cecilia, a girl of 17 newly arrived from school and prone to dramatic pronouncements about the unfairness of nearly everything, whom he indulged with far more patience than his reputation for briskness would have suggested. She noticed, one afternoon in the stable yard, that he knew the names of every groom and stable boy in his employ, and asked after a sick child belonging to one of them with what appeared to be genuine concern rather than performed nobility. None of this was information she wanted. A duke's decency was, to a girl hiding beneath a false name in his household, considerably more dangerous than his indifference would have been. Indifference she could work with. Indifference asked nothing of her. But a man who noticed things, who asked after sick children and remembered small kindnesses, and looked at a maid arranging roses as though she were a person rather than a fixture of the household. That was a man who might, eventually, ask the one question she could never safely answer. The turn came, as such turns often do, on an evening that began unremarkably. Lady Cecilia had taken it into her head, some weeks prior, that she required a lady's maid of her own, one nearer her own age than the elderly woman who had served her since the nursery, someone who might understand, as she put it with the particular self-importance of 17, the way things actually are now. Mrs. Pemberton, reluctant to disrupt the household's careful balance but unwilling to argue with a duke's sister, had settled on Mary for the temporary arrangement, largely because Mary was quiet, competent, and unlikely to gossip. It was in this new capacity, brushing out Lady Cecilia's hair before bed, listening to an extended account of some slight suffered at a neighboring house's dinner party, that Mary made her first true mistake. Cecilia had been describing, with considerable indignation, a young woman at the dinner who had apparently monopolized the conversation with opinions on the political situation in France that Cecilia found both tedious and, she suspected, largely borrowed from her father's newspaper. She went on and on about the price of grain and the unrest among the weavers as though she understood the first thing about it, Cecilia said, when everyone knows the real trouble isn't the grain at all, it's that Parliament won't. It's the Enclosure Acts mostly, Mary said, before she had thought better of it, still working the brush through Cecilia's hair with practiced hands. The land that used to be common ground for grazing and gathering has been fenced off for private use these past years. It's left a great many families with no way to supplement what little they earn, which is why the price of grain matters so much more now than it did a generation ago. It isn't only about the harvest, it's that people have lost the other means they once had to feed themselves. The room went very quiet. Mary realized, a half-second too late, precisely what she had done. It was not the kind of observation a scullery maid made while brushing hair. It was not even the kind of observation most gentlemen bothered to understand fully, let alone articulate with the easy clarity of someone who had once sat through her father's long conversations with his steward and land agent, absorbing far more than either man had realized a young girl in the corner was absorbing. Cecilia had turned in her seat to stare at her, wide-eyed, brush still suspended midair. "How do you know that?" "I overheard it, my lady. Servants talk of such things below stairs." The lie came quickly, but not quickly enough to erase the look on Cecilia's face. Not suspicion exactly. Cecilia was too self-absorbed and too young to be genuinely suspicious of a lady's maid, but something closer to fascination, the delighted surprise of discovering an unexpected object in an ordinary place. "You talk like Papa's old tutor," Cecilia said, half laughing. "Truly, Mary, wherever did a housemaid learn to speak of enclosure acts?" Mary managed with effort to steer the conversation elsewhere, a compliment on the shine of Cecilia's hair, a question about the dress planned for an upcoming assembly, the easy redirection she had become practiced at over these months. Cecilia, mercurial as most girls her age, was diverted easily enough, and by the time Mary left her mistress's rooms that night, she hoped, that the moment had passed without lasting consequence. She did not know that Cecilia, delighted by her discovery of a servant who spoke like a scholar, would mention the incident at breakfast the following morning, in the offhand, chattering way of a girl who saw no danger in it at all. Not to Mrs. Pemberton, not to the other servants, but directly to her brother, over eggs and toast, as an amusing curiosity. "You'll never guess what my maid said last night," Cecilia told him, spooning marmalade onto her toast without looking up. Going on about enclosure acts and grain prices like she'd read the papers herself. "I told her she sounded like your old tutor." The Duke, who had been only half attending to his sister's morning chatter as he read through a stack of correspondence, went very still. "Which maid?" "Mary, the new one you know, the one who dropped your boots that first day, ages ago now." Cecilia laughed at the memory, entirely unaware of the effect her words were having across the table. "She's ever so odd, actually. Terribly proper way of speaking when she forgets herself. And she arranges flowers like she trained under a master gardener." The Duke set down his correspondence very slowly. He said nothing more on the subject that morning. He asked no further questions of his sister, offered no comment beyond a mild, non-committal sound of acknowledgement before returning his attention to his letters. But something had shifted in him, quietly and completely, in the space of that single conversation. The scattered inconsistencies he had been collecting for months, half amused and half curious, suddenly arranging themselves into a shape he did not yet want to name, even to himself. He thought of the books arranged by a system no common household employed. He thought of the flowers cut with an eye for composition no untrained girl possessed. He thought of a young woman who spoke, when she forgot to guard herself, with the fluency of someone raised at a gentleman's table rather than in a gentleman's kitchen. He thought, too, though he pushed the thought away almost as soon as it formed, uncomfortable with where it might lead, of a portrait he had seen perhaps a year prior, hung briefly in a townhouse in London during a visit whose details he could no longer entirely recall, of a girl with the same particular tilt to her chin, the same steady, unflinching eyes. He told himself it was nothing, coincidence, and an idle mind's tendency to build stories from insufficient material. But that evening, for the first time since the night in the library, he found himself in the corridor outside the servant's stair at precisely the hour he knew Mary would pass through it. And when she appeared, tray in hand, startled at the sight of him waiting there, he asked her a single question that he had turned over carefully in his mind throughout the long, distracted length of that day. "Where is your family, Mary?" She had prepared an answer for this question months ago, in the coaching inn, in the moments before she cut her own hair and buried her name along with it. She had rehearsed it enough times that it should have come easily. It did not come easily. Something in the directness of his gaze, the stillness with which he waited, made the careful lie catch in her throat before she managed, finally, to say it. "I have none, your grace, not any longer." It was, in its way, the truest thing she had said to him since she'd arrived, truer than she intended, and he heard it, she could see, as exactly what it was. Not a full lie, but not the whole truth either. A wound spoken around rather than through. He did not press her further that night. But he did not look away first, either, and when she finally excused herself and continued down the corridor, her hands unsteady on the tray she carried, she understood with a cold, sinking certainty that whatever careful invisibility she had built for herself these past months had begun, thread by thread, to come undone, and that the man undoing it had no intention of stopping now that he had started. Word of a missing heiress does not stay contained forever, no matter how carefully the story of her death has been managed. And in the world Lord Holly's moved through, a world of solicitors and land agents, of gossip carried on visiting cards and murmured between footmen waiting outside London townhouses, even a well-managed lie eventually meets someone who remembers too much. For Lord Holly's, that someone arrived in the form of a letter. It came from a distant cousin of the late Earl's, a woman named Mrs. Fairfax who had not attended the memorial service. She had been abroad at the time, nursing a sister through a difficult confinement in Lisbon, and who wrote now, some 8 months after Margaret's supposed death, with a question that Lord Holly's read 3 times before he fully absorbed its implications. "I have only just returned to England and heard the sorrowful news of dear Margaret," the letter read, in the careful, looping hand of a woman entirely unaware of the storm she was about to unleash. "I confess myself deeply puzzled, however, for I am certain I glimpsed her, or a young woman of remarkably similar appearance, in a coaching inn near Reading this past autumn, though I did not think to approach, as I had heard nothing then of any illness and assumed I was simply mistaken. Now I find myself wondering whether the mistake was mine at all. I hope you will forgive an old woman's confusion, but I thought you ought to know." Lord Holly's did not sleep that night. He was, whatever else could be said of him, not a foolish man. He understood immediately what such a letter meant if it fell into the wrong hands, if it reached, say, the family solicitor who had only reluctantly signed off on the estate's transfer, or worse, if it reached anyone with cause to reopen the matter of the Rosemere inheritance in a court of law. An empty grave was one thing. An empty grave discovered to be empty by someone withstanding to ask why was quite another. He wrote back to Mrs. Fairfax with practiced smoothness, assuring her that grief made phantoms of us all, that he understood entirely how such confusion could arise, that he was touched she had thought to write. He asked, with careful casualness, whether she recalled precisely when this sighting had occurred, and whether the coaching inn had a name. She remembered both, in the vague but usable way memory serves an elderly woman recalling an unremarkable afternoon many months past. Reading. Late September, she believed, though she could not swear to the exact week. It was enough for Lord Holly's to begin. He did not conduct the search himself. That would have been imprudent. A man of his standing making inquiries at coaching inns like some common investigator. Instead, he engaged a man discreetly, through channels that left no trace back to Rosemere, a former Bow Street runner named Grimsby, whose reputation for finding what wealthy men wished found, quietly and without excessive questions, was well established among a certain class of desperate or dishonest client. The girl left few marks, Grimsby reported, some weeks into his inquiries, in a meeting conducted in a private room of a public house far from anywhere either man was known. Cut her own hair, by the look of the description I've gathered. Sold what jewelry she carried in a pawnshop 2 streets from the inn, a small ring garnet setting, which the shopkeeper remembered on account of an engraving inside the band. Lord Holly's went very still. The ring had belonged to Margaret's mother. He had not known she carried it with her. After that, Grimsby continued, the trail thins. A girl matching her description was seen boarding a coach heading north and west. Beyond that, my lord, she could be in service in any one of 100 great houses between here and the Midlands. It is not an easy thing, finding one maid among the many, when she has taken pains not to be found. Then take more pains than she has, Lord Holly said, and the coldness in his voice left no ambiguity as to what he expected of the money already changing hands between them. It took Grimsby the better part of 2 months, working through the tedious, patient methods of his old trade, inquiries at pawnshops along likely routes, quiet conversations with coachmen who remembered passengers for the right price, a slow and methodical narrowing of possibility that eventually led him, with grim satisfaction, to a market town not far from a large and well-regarded estate called Ashworth Hall. He did not approach the house directly. He was too experienced for that kind of clumsiness. Instead, he spent several days in the town's public house, drinking slowly and listening carefully, learning from the loose talk of servants on their half-days what he needed to know. That Ashworth Hall had indeed taken on a new scullery maid some months prior, a girl calling herself Mary, quiet and well-spoken for her station, who had lately been elevated to assist the young lady Cecilia. It was enough. Grimsby wrote his report and sent it back to Lord Holly's with the quiet efficiency of a man who considered the job, essentially, complete. Lord Holly's read the report in his study at what had once been Rosemere, now his in name and in law, and felt something twist in his chest that was not quite panic and not quite triumph, but an uneasy mixture of both. The girl was alive. The girl was findable, and so long as she remained alive and findable, everything he had built over the past year, the inheritance, the standing, the careful public grief that had won him considerable sympathy in certain drawing rooms, remained vulnerable to a single conversation, a single moment of recognition, a single person deciding to ask the wrong question in the wrong company. He considered his options with the cold clarity of a man who had already proven, once, that he was capable of far more than most would credit him for. The simplest solution, the one that occurred to him first, and which he sat with longer than he later cared to admit, was one he did not have the stomach to execute personally, though he turned the idea over with a thoroughness that would have horrified anyone who still believed him merely an opportunist rather than something considerably darker. Grimsby, for all his usefulness in matters of discreet inquiry, made it clear through his manner rather than his words that this was not the sort of task his particular skills extended to. Men like Grimsby found the missing. What became of them afterward was, by unspoken arrangement, someone else's concern entirely. Lord Holly settled in the end on a plan that required no violence, only patience and social maneuvering, the tools he understood best. He would go to Ashworth Hall himself, under some plausible pretext, and confirm with his own eyes whether the maid called Mary was truly the niece he had buried. If she was, he would find a quiet way to reclaim her, through the courts, if necessary, arguing that a woman of unsound mind, for surely that would be the easiest story to tell, given how she had vanished, required the protection of her lawful family, or through more direct persuasion if the situation allowed for it. A duke's household, he reasoned, was unlikely to interfere overmuch in the private family matters of a guardian reclaiming a wayward ward. Dukes had their own concerns, and servants, however curious, were rarely worth a nobleman's active interest. He did not yet know how mistaken this assumption would prove to be. The pretext, when it came, arrived with almost suspicious convenience, an invitation extended through mutual acquaintances in London to a gathering the Duke of Ashworth was hosting at his estate the following month. A modest autumn assembly, nothing so grand as a ball, intended primarily to introduce Lady Cecilia more fully into society ahead of her formal debut the following season. Lord Holly's, whose social connections had expanded considerably along with his newfound wealth, secured an invitation for himself and Lady Holly's without particular difficulty. He wrote to confirm his attendance with a steady hand, and a satisfaction he was careful not to let show in his correspondence. At Ashworth Hall, meanwhile, entirely unaware of the danger now making its way toward her with the slow, deliberate patience of a hunter who has finally caught the scent, Mary continued the delicate work of surviving beneath a name that was not her own, increasingly watched by a duke who suspected far more than he had yet confirmed, and entirely ignorant of the fact that the very people who had erased her once already were, even now, preparing to finish what they had started. The weeks leading up to the autumn assembly passed at Ashworth Hall in the particular flurry of activity that any gathering, however modest, demanded of a great house. Furniture was uncovered and polished in rooms rarely used. Extra staff were engaged from the village to help with the additional work. Mrs. Pemberton moved through the corridors with the harried efficiency of a general preparing for battle, and even Mary, still officially attached to Lady Cecilia's service, though increasingly called upon for whatever task the swelling preparations required, found herself pulled in a dozen directions at once, grateful, in a strange way, for the exhaustion that left her too tired most nights to lie awake dwelling on the Duke's growing attention. That attention had not lessened in the weeks since the conversation in the servants' corridor. If anything, it had sharpened, though it expressed itself now in a manner more careful than before, fewer direct questions, more simply a presence she could not quite escape. She would look up from arranging flowers to find him watching from across the lawn, his expression unreadable. She would enter a room to deliver a message and find him already looking toward the door, as though he had somehow known she was coming before she arrived. She told herself with decreasing conviction that she was imagining the pattern of it. It was Lady Cecilia, with her usual heedless enthusiasm, who unwittingly delivered the first piece of true danger. "Papa's old friends are coming," she announced one afternoon, while Mary helped her sort through a chest of ribbons for the assembly. "The Holleyses, do you know them? Lord Holly's inherited some earldom recently, I believe, terribly sad business. His cousin's daughter died of some nervous complaint not long after the old Earl himself passed. Mama always said it was the saddest thing, an entire family gone within the year, though I never met any of them myself." Mary's hands went still over the ribbons. "Rosemere," she said before she could stop herself. "The Earl of Rosemere." Cecilia glanced up, mildly surprised. "Yes, that's the one. How did you know that?" "I must have heard the name mentioned below stairs, my lady. Servants talk of such things." The lie came automatically now, well worn from months of use, though her heart was hammering hard enough that she feared Cecilia might somehow hear it. Cecilia, fortunately, was already distracted by a length of blue ribbon that had tangled itself hopelessly with a length of green, and did not pursue the matter further. Mary excused herself as soon as she reasonably could and spent the remainder of that evening in a state of controlled, silent panic that she dared not show to anyone in the house. Lord Holly's was coming here, to this house, in a matter of weeks. He would walk these halls, attend the very assembly she would almost certainly be called upon to help serve, and there existed a very real possibility, however small she tried to convince herself it was, that he would see her, recognize her, and understand instantly what her survival meant for the comfortable lie he had built his new fortune upon. She considered that night and for several nights after, simply leaving, disappearing again, the way she had disappeared once already, before he could arrive and confirm whatever suspicions had brought him here in the first place. She had done it once. She told herself she could do it again, could vanish into some other county, some other household, some other borrowed name, and begin the exhausting work of hiding all over again. But something held her back, something she was reluctant, even in the privacy of her own thoughts, to examine too closely. It was not merely practical concern, though the practical concerns were real enough. She had no money beyond a few carefully hoarded coins, nowhere obvious to go, and the autumn weather made the prospect of the open road considerably less appealing than it had seemed the previous summer, when desperation had made every alternative look preferable to what she was fleeing. It was something else, too, something that had to do with the particular quality of attention the Duke had shown her these past months, the sense, however foolish, that she had begun to matter to someone in this house in a way that had nothing to do with her usefulness as a servant. She told herself this feeling was dangerous. She told herself, repeatedly, that whatever the Duke's growing curiosity meant, it could not possibly end well for a maid discovered to be living under a false name, hiding from a guardian with a legal claim to her, however corrupt that claim might be in truth. A duke's interest in an oddity among his servants was one thing. A duke's interest in a woman revealed to be an impostor, a fugitive, possibly even if Lord Holly's had his way declared legally unstable, was quite another. And yet she stayed. She told herself it was because she had nowhere better to go. She did not examine too closely whether that was the whole truth. The day of the assembly arrived with the particular golden light of late autumn, the kind of afternoon that made even the practical business of setting tables and arranging chairs feel touched with something like ceremony. Mary spent the morning in a blur of tasks, carrying linens, helping arrange the flowers she had, by now, become quietly known for choosing well, assisting Lady Cecilia into a gown of pale green that suited her far better than the girl herself yet realized. It was in the late afternoon, as guests began arriving and the house filled with the particular hum of a gathering not yet fully underway, that Mary caught her first glimpse of Lord Holly's descending from his carriage. She had positioned herself deliberately in a service corridor with a narrow window overlooking the drive, close enough to see, far enough to remain unseen. She recognized him instantly, despite the year that had passed since she had last laid eyes on him. The same careful, unhurried movements, the same well-tailored coat that never quite disguised the coldness beneath his courtesy. Beside him, Lady Holly's descended with the particular grace of a woman thoroughly satisfied with her improved circumstances. Mary's whole body went cold at the sight of them, standing in her father's in their borrowed grandeur, greeting their host with easy smiles as though they had never done anything in their lives that required the smallest measure of guilt. She spent the remainder of the evening in careful, deliberate avoidance, taking every task that kept her below stairs or in the farthest corners of the house from the main gathering. It worked, for the better part of 3 hours. She heard the music drifting from the ballroom, the murmur of conversation, the particular rhythm of an evening unfolding exactly as such evenings were meant to unfold, and she allowed herself, cautiously, to believe she might survive the night unseen. It was Mrs. Pemberton, harried and short-staffed as the evening wore toward its most demanding hours, who undid 3 months of careful avoidance with a single practical instruction. Mary, His Grace has asked for the good decanter brought up from the cellar, the crystal one, mind, not the plain glass, and Sarah's gone lame with a blister and can't manage the stairs quick enough. Take it through to the drawing room, there's a good girl, and mind you don't dawdle, the guests are asking after refreshment. There was no room for refusal in the instruction, not without raising questions Mary could not afford to raise. She carried the decanter through the SLUGBA corridors toward the drawing room with her heart beating so hard she could feel it in her throat, praying, with an intensity she had not prayed within months, that she might slip in, set down the decanter, and slip out again before anyone thought to look at her too closely. She very nearly succeeded. She had set the decanter down upon the sideboard, had turned to leave with her eyes carefully lowered in the manner she had perfected over months of practiced invisibility, when a voice from across the room, a voice she had not heard in over a year, but which she would have recognized anywhere in any company, for the rest of her life, stopped her utterly still. Margaret. The room did not go silent. The assembled guests continued their conversations, unaware that anything of significance had occurred. But for Mary, every other sound in the world seemed to fall away entirely, leaving only that single word, spoken in a tone of genuine, startled disbelief, hanging in the air between herself and Lord Holly's. She had two choices, and she understood, in the space of that single frozen second, that she had perhaps 3 seconds in which to make one. She could deny it outright, claim confusion, insist he had mistaken her for someone else, and pray that her months of careful transformation had altered her enough to make the lie plausible. Or she could run, abandon the decanter and every shred of dignity she had left, and hope to disappear into the house before he could raise a proper alarm. She chose, in the end, neither. She turned to face him fully, for the first time in over a year, and found that the girl who had once trembled beneath his cold courtesy in her father's drawing room was not, entirely, the same woman standing before him now. Something in her had hardened these past months, tempered by cold and hunger and the daily discipline of survival, into something Lord Holly's had not accounted for when he'd set his careful trap the year before. "I don't know who you mean," she said, her voice steadier than she had any right to expect. "My name is Mary, sir. I believe you must be mistaken." It was, she knew even as she said it, a hopeless lie. His face had already betrayed too much recognition for any denial to fully undo it. But it bought her something, however small, a moment of doubt, a flicker of uncertainty in his expression as his rational mind warred against what his eyes were telling him. That flicker was interrupted by a voice from the doorway, calm, measured, and entirely unexpected. "Is there some difficulty?" The Duke of Ashworth stood in the drawing-room's entrance, having entered, it seemed, at the precise moment his name might have proven most useful, though whether by coincidence or design, Mary could not say. His eyes moved from Lord Holly's to Mary and back again, taking in the scene, the abandoned decanter, the color drained from his maid's face, the strange intensity with which his guest was staring at her, with the same careful, assessing quality she had noticed in him from their very first meeting. "Your Grace." Lord Holly's recovered his composure with the practiced smoothness of a man well accustomed to social performance, though Mary could see, in the tightness around his eyes, that the recovery cost him something. "Forgive me. I was momentarily startled. Your maid bears an extraordinary resemblance to a young relation of mine, now sadly deceased. The likeness quite overcame me for a moment." "Does she?" The Duke's voice was perfectly pleasant, perfectly unreadable, and Mary, watching him carefully, could not tell whether he believed a word of the explanation being offered. How unfortunate to be reminded so unexpectedly of a loss. Quite unfortunate, yes. Lord Holly's gaze flicked back to Mary, and something in it had shifted from startled recognition to something colder, more calculating, a man recalculating his approach in real time. "I wonder, Your Grace, if I might have a word with your maid privately before I take my leave this evening, simply to satisfy my own curiosity. Family resemblances can be such peculiar, haunting things." It was, on its surface, an entirely reasonable request, the kind of small, sentimental indulgence a grieving relation might plausibly ask of any host. Mary felt the ground shifting dangerously beneath her, understood that a private conversation with Lord Holly's, away from witnesses, was very possibly the last conversation she would ever have as a free woman. But before she could speak, before she could find any words at all to extract herself from the trap now closing around her, the Duke answered for her, in a tone that carried, beneath its surface courtesy, something considerably harder than she had ever heard from him before. "I'm afraid that won't be possible tonight, Lord Holly's. My household staff are occupied with the evening's demands, and I find I have some questions of my own I'd like answered first, questions, I think, that touch rather more directly on the matter than a passing resemblance." The silence that followed lasted only a moment, but it stretched, for Mary, like an eternity. The Duke's steady gaze fixed on Lord Holly's with an intensity that suggested he had, in fact, understood a great deal more than either of them had credited him for, and that the careful, patient watching of these past months had finally arrived at the question he had been waiting to ask. The remainder of the assembly passed in a blur that Mary would later find almost impossible to reconstruct with any clarity. She remembered Mrs. Pemberton appearing, summoned by some signal from the Duke that Mary hadn't seen given, and being led, not dismissed. She would understand only later, but deliberately removed from the room, to the housekeeper's private parlor, where she sat for the better part of an hour in a state of frozen, exhausted terror, listening to the distant, muffled sounds of the assembly continuing without her, as though the entire world had not just tilted dangerously on its axis. She did not know what passed between the Duke and Lord Holly's in the time that followed. She would learn of it only later in pieces, first from an unusually subdued Lady Cecilia and later, more fully, from the Duke himself. What she did know was that some 2 hours after the confrontation in the drawing-room, long after the last carriages had departed, and the house had settled into the particular hollow quiet that follows any large gathering, there came a soft knock at the door of the housekeeper's parlor, and the Duke of Ashworth entered alone, still dressed in his evening clothes, his expression carrying none of the careful, unreadable courtesy she had grown accustomed to over these past months. "Mrs. Pemberton," he said, with a nod that was as much dismissal as greeting, and the housekeeper, understanding perfectly, rose and left the room without a word, closing the door softly behind her. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Mary sat with her hands folded tightly in her lap, bracing herself for whatever accusation, whatever demand, whatever final unraveling was about to arrive. She had spent the better part of 2 hours constructing and discarding a dozen different explanations, none of which felt adequate to the enormity of what she had concealed. "I sent Lord Holly's and his wife away," the Duke said finally, with the clear understanding that they were not welcome to return to this house, and that any further attempt to contact a member of my household without my express permission would be met with considerably less patience than I extended tonight. Mary's breath caught. "Your Grace." "I am not finished." He crossed the room slowly and took the chair across from her, the same careful, deliberate movement she had come to associate with him, though there was something different in them now, some restraint being consciously exercised. "He told me a great deal in the time we spoke. Some of it, I think, he did not intend to tell me at all. Men in a panic reveal more than they mean to, and Lord Holly's was, by the end of our conversation, very nearly panicked indeed." She said nothing. There was nothing left to say that would not simply confirm what she suspected he already knew. "He told me," the Duke continued, his voice carefully level, though something beneath it suggested the effort that level tone required, that his cousin's daughter, the Lady Margaret Winslow, only child and heir of the late Earl of Rosemere, did not, in fact, die of a nervous decline in the north of England, as he had allowed the world to believe for over a year. He told me, when I pressed him rather more directly than social convention generally permits, that she had disappeared under circumstances he described, not very convincingly, as tragic misfortune. And he told me finally, when I asked him plainly whether the young woman serving in my household tonight was this same Lady Margaret, that he could not be entirely certain, though his eyes, I think, told me rather more than his words did. Mary felt something break loose in her chest, not relief exactly, not yet, but the particular exhaustion of a truth too long suppressed finally finding air. "I am Margaret," she said quietly. It was the first time she had spoken her true name aloud in over a year. "Lady Margaret Winslow. My father was the Earl of Rosemere, and he died believing his cousin would look after me, when in truth Lord Hollies had already begun arranging to have me disappeared so thoroughly that no one would ever think to question his inheritance. She told him everything then: the physician's false diagnosis, the carriage ride toward an unnamed destination, the desperate flight from the coaching inn, the year spent surviving under a name that was not her own because the alternative was a fate she still could not fully name even now, months later, in the relative safety of a duke's private parlor. The duke listened without interruption, his expression growing darker with each detail, though his composure never fully broke, the careful control of a man who had learned, long ago, that fury was best channeled rather than displayed. "Why did you not come to me?" he asked when she had finished. "The moment you understood I suspected something, I would have." "Would you?" The question came out sharper than she intended, though not unkindly. "Your Grace, I was a maid in your household with no proof of anything I claimed, accusing a titled peer of arranging my disappearance and quite possibly my father's death. Who was I to convince anyone of such a thing? A duke's household has its own reputation to protect. I could not risk." "You could have trusted me." The simplicity of the statement stopped her. There was no anger in it, only a quiet, direct honesty that undid something in her more thoroughly than any accusation could have. "I did not know," she said finally, "that I was permitted to." He was quiet a long moment, studying her with an expression she had never quite seen from him before, the careful, assessing distance she had grown accustomed to entirely gone, replaced by something rawer, more immediate. "You are permitted now," he said, "and you will have, from this moment, every resource this house and my name can provide, to see your inheritance restored and Lord Hollies answer properly for what he has done. I have already sent word to my own solicitor in London, a man considerably more thorough than whatever poor excuse for legal counsel allowed your father's will to be altered so conveniently. We will need Mrs. Fairfax's testimony regarding the sighting that set his search in motion, and I suspect, once the right questions are asked in the right offices, we will find considerably more evidence of fraud than Lord Hollies anticipated ever being uncovered." The weeks that followed moved with a speed that left Margaret. She allowed herself, finally, to think of herself by her true name again, almost dizzy with the transformation of her circumstances. The Duke's solicitor proved every bit as thorough as promised, uncovering within a fortnight sufficient evidence of forged signatures and falsified physicians' reports to make Lord Hollies's position considerably more precarious than his careful year of consolidated wealth had led him to believe possible. Mrs. Fairfax, once located and properly questioned, provided testimony that closed the final gap in the case against him. Faced with the prospect of a public trial that would expose not only the fraud but potentially far darker questions about the circumstances of the old Earl's death, Lord Hollies chose, in the end, to relinquish his claim to the Rosemere estate entirely rather than risk the gallows-adjacent consequences of a full legal reckoning. A quiet, humiliating surrender that saw him and Lady Hollies depart for the continent within the month, their reputation in ruins, their fortune considerably diminished by the settlements required to avoid criminal prosecution. Margaret's inheritance was restored in full by the new year. The estate, the titles associated properties, and the fortune that had rightfully been hers all along, now returned under the careful stewardship of solicitors who answered, this time, to her directly rather than to a guardian with his own interests at heart. She did not, in the end, need to manage any of it entirely alone. 1 year to the day after a rain-soaked girl had first walked through the servants' gate at Ashworth Hall, carrying nothing but a small bundle and a borrowed name, Lady Margaret Winslow stood once more at those same gates, though this time she arrived by her own carriage, in her own name, wearing a gown of deep blue silk that no one had handed down to her out of pity. The house had been transformed for the occasion. Every window glowed with candlelight. The drive was lined with carriages bearing the crests of half the great families of the county. All of them arrived to witness what London's gossip columns had, for weeks now, been calling the most unexpected match of the season. The Duke of Ashworth, long considered impervious to matrimonial pursuit, marrying not the daughter of some ambitious political family or the favored beauty of a fashionable London season, but a young heiress whose extraordinary story of survival and vindication had, by now, been told and retold in drawing rooms from Bath to Edinburgh. Margaret had grown accustomed, in the month since Lord Hollies's disgrace, to being looked at differently. Where once she had trained herself to invisibility, she now found herself the subject of curious, admiring glances wherever she went, the girl who had lost everything, and through some combination of courage and fortune, reclaimed it entirely. She found she did not mind the attention nearly as much as she once might have. There was a particular satisfaction in being seen, finally, exactly as she was. But it was not the assembled guests, nor the admiring whispers, nor even the restored grandeur of her own name that occupied her thoughts as she climbed the front steps of Ashworth Hall that evening. It was the memory, unexpectedly vivid, of another arrival at these same steps. Cold, frightened, carrying muddy boots, she had not yet learned to balance properly against her hip. The Duke met her in the entrance hall, dressed in the formal splendor the occasion demanded, though his eyes, when they found hers across the crowded room, held the same steady warmth she had come to know so well over the past year, first as careful observation, then as quiet loyalty, and finally, in the month since Lord Hollies's departure, as something neither of them had any further reason to hide. "You're early," he said, crossing to meet her, a smile playing at the corner of his mouth that she now recognized as entirely genuine, nothing at all like the careful, unreadable courtesy of their first uncertain months together. "I wanted a moment," she said, "before the evening properly begins." He offered his arm and she took it, and together they walked toward the drawing room where their wedding guests waited. The same room, she realized with a small, private smile, where he had once found her frozen with fear before Lord Hollies's accusing stare, and where he had chosen, in that critical moment, to stand between her and everything that threatened to undo her. "Do you remember," she asked, as they paused just outside the doors, "the first day I arrived here?" "I remember it very well." His hand covered hers where it rested on his arm. "You dropped my boots directly onto my feet and looked as though you expected to be dismissed on the spot. You didn't even ask my name." "No." He turned to face her fully, the noise of the gathering beyond the doors fading for a moment into something distant and unimportant. "But I asked it eventually, and I never forgot the answer once I finally had it." She laughed, a real laugh, unguarded, the kind she had not allowed herself in the long, careful months of hiding, and it was this sound, more than anything else, that seemed to settle something in him, some last quiet worry that the girl who had survived so much might never fully allow herself to feel safe again. "For what it's worth," he added, as he reached to open the doors before them, "I am glad every day that you dropped those boots. Even though it ruined your good coat that morning. Especially because of that." His smile widened. "I have never been more grateful for a pair of muddy boots in my entire life." The doors opened before them, revealing the warm, candle-lit room beyond, filled with guests waiting to witness the joining of two people who had found each other through the unlikeliest of circumstances. A duke who had learned to look past the surface of things, and a woman who had learned, finally, that she no longer needed to hide who she truly was. Lady Margaret Winslow walked through those doors on the arm of the Duke of Ashworth, no longer a girl running from her own name, but a woman who had reclaimed it entirely, and who understood at last that the very worst chapter of her life had led her, however improbably, directly to the very best one. Thank you for listening to the story all the way to the end. Please tell us which city you're watching from and what the story made you feel. Don't forget to subscribe so you won't miss new stories.